The air in the apartment was thin and cold. It tasted of cardboard and the clean, chemical scent of glass cleaner. Alara sat on the floor, her back against the only wall that still felt familiar. Everything else was gone or going. Two men in gray jumpsuits moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that felt like a violation. They did not speak to her. They did not need to. Their instructions came from Julian. She watched them wrap the large abstract painting, the one Julian had bought at a gallery opening where they drank champagne that tasted like sharp, tiny stars. He had told her it was an investment in their future. Now its future was in a moving truck, and hers was sitting on a polished hardwood floor in a box. The apartment had been their shared space for 3 years, a testament to Julian's rising career in finance. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the city that never slept, furniture that cost more than her first car. She had thought it was her life, too. She had arranged the books on the shelves, chosen the soft gray towels, learned the quirks of the espresso machine. Now she saw it for what it was, a stage set, and her role had been written out of the play. Her grandfather's funeral was 2 weeks ago, a quiet, somber affair in a town she barely remembered, attended by a handful of old men with calloused hands and kind eyes. Julian had come, of course. He had held her hand, his thumb making smooth, reassuring circles on her skin. He had been the perfect picture of the supportive partner. The support lasted until the will was read. Thomas Harmon, her grandfather, had little to his name. No stocks, no bonds, no savings accounts worth mentioning. He had his tools, his old truck, and a piece of waterfront property the local solicitor described as largely dilapidated. Julian's sympathy evaporated. It was a visible thing, like steam rising off hot pavement after a summer rain. His hand had stilled in hers. His posture changed. The calculations were running behind his eyes, swift and silent. He had been banking on a windfall, a coastal property he could flip. A ruin was not part of the plan. He drove them back to the city in a tense, humming silence. The next morning, he had a spreadsheet ready. "It's just cleaner this way, Alara," he had said, not looking at her. He was looking at the numbers on his laptop screen. "We need to liquidate the shared assets, separate our finances." She had stared at him. "Separate?" "We're not on the same page anymore," he said. It was a line from a corporate memo, devoid of emotion, final. She was 24 years old. She had dropped out of her design program to support his career, to manage their home, to be the person who was always there when he walked through the door. She had invested her time, her youth, her love. He had invested his money. It turned out only one of those was legally binding. The sofa she was leaning against was his. The lease was in his name. The car in the garage was his. The art, the rugs, the custom-built bed frame, his. He had the receipts to prove it. He was meticulous. A shadow fell over her. One of the movers stood there, holding a single, medium-sized cardboard box. "This everything, miss?" Alara looked at the box, her books, a few sweaters, a framed photo of her and her grandfather on a fishing trip when she was 10, her entire life, condensed into a cube of cardboard. She nodded, unable to speak. The man placed it on the floor beside her. He seemed to hesitate, a flicker of pity in his eyes. Then he turned and went back to work. The finality of it was suffocating. She was a ghost in her own life, watching it being dismantled and packed away. Julian had taken everything, not with a shout, but with a signature on a contract. It was a neat, tidy dispossession, a bloodless coup. The buzz of the intercom startled her. She stood up, her legs stiff. She pressed the button. "Mail delivery," a voice crackled. She went down to the lobby. The concierge, a man who had always greeted her with a warm, "Good morning, Miss Vance," now looked through her, his eyes focused on a spot over her shoulder. He handed her a small stack of letters, bills addressed to Julian, a magazine, and a thick, cream-colored envelope with a lawyer's insignia embossed in the corner. It was from the same solicitor in Port Blossom who had handled her grandfather's estate. She went back upstairs. The apartment was nearly empty now. The movers were taking the last of the chairs. The echo of her footsteps was unnervingly loud. She sat on the floor again, the box her only companion, and opened the envelope. Inside was a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key, and a folded document. The deed to Harmon's Landing. The front door opened. Julian walked in. He surveyed the empty space with a look of satisfaction. A clean slate. "Good," he said. "They were efficient." He saw the envelope in her hand. "What's that?" "From my grandfather's lawyer," she said, her voice flat. He walked over and plucked the key from her palm. He dangled it between his thumb and forefinger, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, the grand inheritance," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "A rotten marina in Port Blossom. Appraised at, what was it? $5,000. Land value only. The structures were deemed a liability." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that bounced off the bare walls. "I guess his name was the only one on that piece of junk. Good luck with it. It's a money pit. A final joke from the old man." He tossed the key back to her. It landed in her lap with a dull clink, a final insult, a gesture of false generosity, leaving her with the one thing he deemed utterly worthless. "The locks will be changed in an hour," he said, turning to leave. He paused at the door. "It's for the best, Alara. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Then he was gone. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space. She was alone. She sat there for a long time, the silence pressing in on her. The city hummed outside the window, a world that no longer included her. She looked at the box of her belongings. She looked at the heavy brass key in her hand. A money pit, a joke, a worthless inheritance. It was all she had left. She picked up the key. It felt solid in her hand, real, unlike the life she had just lost. She had $412 in her bank account, a box of memories, and a key to a ruin on a distant coast. A strange sense of calm settled over her. Julian was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The bus ride was a long, slow surrender. Alara watched the gleaming towers of the city shrink in the dirt-streaked window, replaced by an endless sprawl of suburbs, then flat, anonymous farmland. She leaned her head against the cool glass, the vibration of the engine a constant, low hum. She didn't sleep. She just watched the world slide by, a landscape of strangers. Each stop brought on a new set of faces, each with their own destinations, their own stories. She felt invisible, a passenger in transit between a life that was over and one that hadn't yet begun. After 12 hours, she changed buses in a grimy, fluorescent-lit station. The air here smelled different. It was heavy with the damp, briny tang of the coast. The people were different, too. Their faces were weathered, their movements slower, more deliberate. The second bus was smaller, older. It rattled and groaned as it wound its way along a 2-lane highway that hugged the shoreline. Through the window, she caught glimpses of the ocean, a vast expanse of gray under a pale, overcast sky. The final stop was Port Blossom. It wasn't so much a town as a collection of buildings huddled around a small harbor. A general store, a diner, a post office, and a handful of houses with peeling paint and wind-beaten gardens. The bus hissed to a stop and she stepped out. The air was thick with the smell of salt, diesel, and drying seaweed. Gulls cried overhead, their calls sharp and lonely. It felt like a place at the edge of the world. There was a single taxi, a beat-up sedan with a rusty roof rack, parked in front of the general store. The driver, a man with a graying beard and a faded baseball cap, looked up from his newspaper as she approached. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Harmon's Landing," she said. The man's eyebrows rose a fraction. "You sure? Ain't nothing out there but gulls and ghosts. Hasn't been for years." "I'm sure," she said, hoisting her backpack. She had sold the contents of her box, the books, the nice sweaters, at a second-hand shop for bus fare and a little extra. The photo of her and her grandfather was tucked safely in her wallet. The driver shrugged. "Your money." He put her backpack in the trunk and she slid into the back seat. The car smelled of stale coffee and old fish. They drove through the small town and turned onto a narrow road that quickly devolved from cracked asphalt to gravel. The trees grew thicker here, their branches interlocking overhead, to form a dark green tunnel. The road became a dirt track, deeply rutted and overgrown. Branches scraped against the sides of the car. "Road's not maintained past this point," the driver grunted, wrestling with the steering wheel. "County gave up on it a decade ago." After another 10 minutes of jarring, bouncing travel, he pulled to a stop. "This is as far as I go. The track gets worse up ahead. You'll have to walk the rest of the way. Maybe a quarter mile." She paid him, the fare taking a painful chunk of her remaining cash. He hefted her backpack out of the trunk and set it on the ground. "You got a key to the place?" he asked, a note of concern in his voice. She nodded. "All right then," he said, tipping his cap. "Good luck to you, miss." He got back in his car, executed a difficult 3-point turn, and rumbled back down the track, leaving her in a profound and sudden silence. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. She shouldered her backpack, which felt impossibly heavy, and started walking. The track was barely a path now, a faint suggestion of a road swallowed by weeds and encroaching forest. After a few hundred yards, the trees opened up, and she saw it. Harmon's Landing. Her heart sank. Julian's dismissive words echoed in her mind. A rotten marina. A money pit. He wasn't wrong. A weathered, hand-carved sign hung at a drunken angle from a single post. Harmon's Landing. The letters were faded, barely legible. Beyond it, a scene of complete and utter decay. The main boathouse, a large 2-story structure, sagged in the middle, its roof a patchwork of missing shingles and tar paper. Windows were boarded up or broken, dark, vacant eyes staring out at her. A thick curtain of ivy covered one entire wall, its tendrils prying at the siding. A series of wooden docks extended out into a small, protected cove, but they were in a state of catastrophic disrepair. Planks were missing, creating treacherous gaps. Pylons were encrusted with barnacles and slick green algae. One entire section of the main pier had collapsed into the murky water. A small cabin stood off to one side, nestled in a grove of pines. Its porch roof had caved in on one side, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. The whole place looked like it was being slowly, inexorably reclaimed by nature, swallowed by the forest and the sea. Despair washed over her, cold and sharp. This was a mistake, a fool's errand. She had traded a life of sterile luxury for one of absolute ruin. There was nothing here for her, nothing but rot and decay. She sank down onto her backpack, the rough dirt of the path pressing through her jeans. The sheer scale of the dereliction was overwhelming. It would take a fortune to fix this, a fortune she did not have. It would take a crew of men, heavy machinery. She was just one person with $400 and a brass key. She felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, hot and bitter. For the first time since Julian had uttered the word separate, she felt truly, hopelessly lost. She sat there for a long time, watching the gray water lap against the broken pilings. The wind was cold, carrying the damp chill of the ocean. She thought about turning back, walking back to the main road, hitching a ride, going anywhere but here. But where would she go? There was no back to go to. The apartment was gone. The life was gone. Julian was gone. This ruin, this money pit, this joke of an inheritance. It was the only thing in the world that was hers. Slowly, she got to her feet. She walked toward the sagging boathouse, her boots crunching on the gravel and weeds. She had to see. She had to know just how bad it was. She reached the main doors. They were huge, big enough to move a boat through, made of thick, weathered planks. A heavy-duty chain and a rusty padlock held them together, but beside them was a smaller, man-sized door. The keyhole was brass, tarnished green by the salt air. She took the key from her pocket. It felt heavy, substantial. She slid it into the lock. It was stiff, gritty with sand and time. She had to jiggle it, putting her shoulder into the door. For a moment, she thought it was rusted solid. Then, with a loud grating click, the lock turned. She pushed the door. It groaned in protest, scraping against the floor, but it opened. She stepped inside. The air was thick and musty, heavy with the dust of years, but underneath the smell of decay and damp, there was something else, a rich, clean scent, cedar, and the faint, pleasant aroma of linseed oil and old metal. Shafts of afternoon light pierced the gloom through gaps in the boarded-up windows, illuminating swirling clouds of dust motes. The interior was vast, a cathedral of timber. The space was filled with the hulking shapes of machinery, shrouded in canvas tarps, workbenches covered in a thick layer of grime, and racks of wood neatly stacked against the far wall. She walked further in, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She ran a hand along the edge of a massive workbench. It was coated in dust, but beneath it, the wood was smooth, worn by years of use. She looked at the corner. It was a dovetail joint, so precise and tight that it looked like a single piece of wood. No nails, no screws, just craftsmanship. Section She looked up. The massive beams that supported the roof were hand-hewn, each one fitting into the next with breathtaking precision. And despite the sag she had seen from the outside, the main ridgepole was perfectly straight. The roof sagged because the shingles were gone, not because the structure was failing. The bones of the building were strong. She crossed the floor, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The floorboards were thick, wide planks of what looked like old-growth fir. They were dirty and stained, but they didn't creak or groan under her weight. They were solid. She went to the back of the boathouse, where a set of enormous winches and pulleys were mounted to the wall, designed for hauling boats out of the water. They were rusted, but they looked powerful, elemental, built to last. Her grandfather had built this place. This wasn't the work of a contractor cutting corners. This was the work of a master craftsman, a man who understood wood and weight and time. A man who had built this place not just to stand, but to endure. She felt a shift inside her. The despair didn't vanish, but it was joined by something new, a flicker of awe, a spark of curiosity. This place wasn't just a ruin, it was a secret. Julian had seen a liability. The solicitor had seen a dilapidated property. They had looked at the peeling paint and the broken windows. They hadn't seen the bones. Her grandfather had left her a puzzle, a wreck on the surface, with a heart of solid gold hidden underneath. A thing isn't ruined, he used to tell her when she was a child, after she dropped a toy and chipped it. It just has a story now. Alara looked around the vast, silent boathouse, at the perfect joints, the solid floors, the true beams. This place had a story, a deep one. And for the first time, she felt a quiet, determined urge to learn how to read it. The walk into Port Blossom felt different this time. The quarter-mile of overgrown track didn't feel menacing, and the 2 miles of gravel road into the huddle of buildings felt like a journey with a purpose. She needed supplies, food, water, cleaning products, a plan. She had spent the last 2 days in a blur of discovery. After exploring the boathouse, she had forced open the door to the small cabin. It was a wreck inside, mouse droppings, a thick layer of dust over everything, a musty smell that caught in the back of her throat. But like the boathouse, the bones were good. A stone fireplace, straight walls, a floor that was solid underfoot. She had found a hand pump for a well just behind the cabin. After a solid 20 minutes of furious, squealing work, it had started to draw water. It came out brown at first, then cleared. It was cold and tasted of iron and earth. It was the best water she'd ever had. Progress. Small, but real. She walked past the taxi stand and the post office, heading for the building with a faded sign that read, Port Blossom General Store and Diner. A small bell chimed as she pushed the door open. The inside was a warm, cluttered mix of smells: frying bacon, fresh coffee, sawdust, and something vaguely like cinnamon. One side of the room was a small grocery, its shelves stocked with canned goods, bread, and basic necessities. The other side had a long Formica counter with 6 red vinyl stools and a few small tables. An older woman with a cloud of white hair pinned up on her head and a flour-dusted apron stood behind the counter, pouring coffee for a fisherman in oilskins. She looked up as Alara entered, her eyes a sharp, intelligent blue. Alara felt suddenly self-conscious. She was covered in grime. Her hair was a mess, and her clothes were stained with rust and dirt from the well pump. She walked over to the grocery shelves, picking up a loaf of bread, a can of beans, and a bottle of water. She needed to be practical. "You look like you've been wrestling with a ghost." The voice was warm, with a slight rasp. Alara turned. The woman from behind the counter was wiping down a section near her, her movements efficient and practiced. "Something like that," Alara admitted. The woman's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Find a seat," she said, gesturing with her rag toward the counter. "First coffee's on the house. You look like you need it." Alara hesitated, then slid onto one of the red vinyl stools. It felt like an unimaginable luxury. The woman placed a thick ceramic mug in front of her and filled it with steaming black coffee. "I'm Martha," she said. "Alara." Martha studied her for a moment, her gaze missing nothing. "You're not from around here, but you're not a tourist either. Tourists don't show up in October with dirt on their face and determination in their eyes." "I inherited a place nearby," Alara said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Harmon's Landing." Martha's expression softened instantly. A wave of recognition, and something else, sadness maybe, passed over her face. She leaned against the counter, her work forgotten. "Thomas Harmon's place," she said softly. "So you're the granddaughter, Alara." Alara looked up, surprised. "You knew him?" "Knew him?" Martha let out a small, fond laugh. "Honey, I knew Thomas for 40 years. He ate breakfast at this counter 3 times a week. Sat right where you're sitting. He was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but he was a good man. The best kind." A lump formed in Alara's throat. It was the first time anyone had spoken of her grandfather as more than just a name on a deed. "The lawyer said the place was—" Alara searched for the word. "Dilapidated." Martha snorted, a sound of pure derision. "Lawyers! They know numbers, not wood. They see a peeling coat of paint and call it a teardown. They don't see the heart inside. Thomas built that place with his own 2 hands. Every beam, every joint. He used old-growth timber he salvaged himself from a shipwreck, up the coast. Said the salt had cured it, made it stronger." She poured herself a coffee and leaned on the counter, facing Alara. The diner was empty now, the fisherman having paid and left. "He was a master boat builder, you know. People sent him boats from all over the country. Said he could heal them. He understood the soul of a boat. And he put that same understanding into the Marina." "My mother," Alara began, then stopped. She didn't talk about him much. They were estranged. Martha's face tightened. "I know. Your mother. She wanted a different life. She was ashamed of him, ashamed that he worked with his hands. She married that man, the one with the soft hands and the fancy car, and she cut Thomas out. told everyone he was just a simple laborer. It broke his heart. But he never, ever stopped loving you. The words hit Alara with the force of a physical blow. She had always been told a different story, that her grandfather was stubborn, proud, and had pushed his daughter away. He talked about you all the time, Martha continued, her voice gentle now. Showed me your school pictures, kept them right in his wallet. He was so proud of you. He always said that Marina was for you. It's for Alara, he'd say. She'll know what to do with it. She has my hands. Alara looked down at her own hands, resting on the counter. They were smudged with dirt. A nail was broken. A blister was forming on her palm from the water pump. For the first time, she didn't see them as unmanicured or messy. She saw them as capable. He spent the last 10 years working on it, Martha said. After he retired from the boat building, said he was getting it ready. People around here thought he was crazy, pouring his time into a place that was falling down. But he wasn't fixing it. He was fortifying it, making it ready. For you. Martha paused, taking a sip of her coffee. He put his heart in his work, Thomas did. Literally. You remember that. He was a man who hid things in plain sight. The phrase snagged in Alara's mind. He put his heart in his work. Literally. She finished her coffee, her mind racing. She bought her groceries, adding a bag of coffee and a thick slice of Martha's apple pie to the pile. Martha charged her half of what the prices said, waving away Alara's protests. Your family, she said simply. Thomas's family is Port Blossom's family. You need anything? You come here. You need a hot meal? You come here. You understand? Alara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She walked out of the diner and back into the crisp, autumn air, the world looking different yet again. The marina wasn't a burden. It was a trust. It wasn't a ruin. It was a sanctuary, built for her. When she got back to the property, the walk felt shorter, lighter. As she approached the cabin, she saw something that made her stop. Sitting on the broken porch, as if he had been waiting for her, was a dog. An old golden retriever, his coat the color of faded honey, his muzzle white with age. He watched her approach, his tail giving a slow, tentative thump, thump, thump against the weathered planks. He was skinny, but his eyes were clear and calm. He looked like he belonged there. She approached slowly, holding out a hand. Hey there, she said softly. The dog sniffed her hand, then gave it a gentle lick. He seemed unafraid, familiar. She remembered Martha saying her grandfather had been a quiet man. Maybe this was his companion. She opened the cabin door and the dog followed her inside, his claws clicking on the floorboards. He curled up on the dusty rag rug in front of the cold fireplace with a contented sigh, as if he had finally come home. Alara felt a strange sense of rightness. A home, a dog. It was a start. She unpacked her groceries, her mind replaying Martha's words. He put his heart in his work. Literally. He hid things in plain sight. She looked around the small, single-room cabin. It was simple. A bed frame in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs, a wood stove for heat and cooking, and the stone fireplace. The wood stove. It was the heart of the cabin, the source of warmth. She ran her hand over the dusty surface. It was a heavy, cast-iron stove, solid and dependable. It sat on a hearth of flat stones. She knelt down, examining the floor around it. The floorboards were tight, seamless, except for one. Right under the lip of the hearth, almost completely hidden. The cut was so fine she had missed it before. It wasn't a loose board. It was a fitted panel, cut with the same precision as the dovetail joints in the boathouse. Her heart started to beat faster. She used the tip of her small pocket knife to pry at the edge. It lifted easily. Beneath it was a hollow space, and in that space, wrapped in a thick, oiled canvas, was a package. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was heavy, solid. She untied the twine holding the canvas together and folded back the stiff, waterproof fabric. Inside were 3 leather-bound books. They looked like old ship's logs, their covers worn smooth with time. She opened the first one. On the first page, in a strong, clear, slightly slanted hand, was an inscription. For Alara, if you're reading this, you found my heart, and you are ready to begin. She sank back on her heels, the book open in her lap. The old dog, Rusty she decided to call him, lifted his head and rested his chin on her knee. The cabin was quiet, filled with the fading afternoon light. Alara began to read. The ink smelled of time and intention. It was her grandfather's voice, speaking to her across the years. A blueprint, a guide, a letter of love in the form of a ledger. The work was about to begin. She had everything she needed. The journals were a revelation. They were her grandfather's mind, laid bare on the page. They were part meticulous construction log, part philosophical treatise, part personal diary, and they were all for her. The first journal detailed the deconstruction of the old, failing Marina that had stood on the site before. Thomas had taken it apart piece by piece, salvaging every usable plank, every nail, every bit of hardware. "A thing isn't ruined until you give up on its story," he wrote. "Most people saw a wreck. I saw a library of good, honest materials, waiting for a new sentence." He cataloged everything. The type of wood, its condition, its best use. Old-growth cedar from the main structure was set aside for the cabin's interior walls. Longleaf pine from the docks, dense and resinous, was stacked and dried for flooring. Even the rusty nails were straightened, cleaned, and sorted by size. Nothing was wasted. Alara spent 3 days doing nothing but reading. She sat by the window in the cabin, Rusty at her feet, and absorbed her grandfather's words. She learned about the foundation of the boathouse, how he had sunk new pilings deep into the bedrock of the cove, not just the mud. She read about the joinery he used, ancient techniques that locked the timbers together without relying on metal, allowing the building to flex in the high coastal winds instead of fighting them. The journals were also a love letter. Woven between notes on concrete mixtures and roofing tar were messages for her. October 5th. The autumn light is perfect today. It reminds me of the color of your hair when you were a little girl, standing in the sun. I am setting the main beam for the boathouse roof. It is the spine of this place. It must be true and strong. Like you. March 22nd. A storm blew in last night. A real northeaster. I sat in the cabin and listened to the wind. The house held. The foundation is good. A good foundation is everything, Alara. In a house, and in a person. Never forget that. She learned that he had built the small cabin first, as his base of operations, a place to live and work while he resurrected the marina around him. It was his test case, his proof of concept. Armed with this new knowledge, she saw the property with different eyes. It was no longer an overwhelming mess. It was a series of tasks, a list to be checked off. She started with the cabin. It was her sanctuary, her home base. It had to be whole. The journal entry for the roof was precise. Leaking near the chimney flashing. Used a temporary patch of tar. The real fix needs new copper flashing, which is stored in the loft of the boathouse in a crate marked CF. She found the crate exactly where he said it would be. It was full of beautiful, heavy copper sheets. She had never done roofing work in her life, but the journal had a section for that too. Detailed diagrams, notes on how to cut the metal, how to fold it, how to seal it. "Go slow," he wrote. "Measure twice. Cut once. The roof is what keeps the world out. Respect the responsibility." It took her 2 full days. She dragged the heavy ladder from the boathouse, wrestled it into position against the cabin. She climbed up, her stomach fluttering with fear. The roof was steep, but the journal had an entry for that too. "Nailed temporary toe holds on the north side. Be careful. They are 20 years old now." She found the small wooden blocks, tested them, and used them to inch her way up to the chimney. The work was painstaking. Her hands, soft from a life of keyboards and city living, were clumsy at first. She cut her finger on the sharp edge of the copper. She dropped her hammer, watching it slide down the roof and thud to the ground. But she kept going. She followed his instructions to the letter. She measured. She cut. She fitted the flashing into place, piece by piece. When she was done, she sat on the peak of the roof, exhausted, her muscles aching, her hands raw. But the chimney was sealed. The roof was whole. A deep, unfamiliar sense of satisfaction washed over her. She had not just fixed a thing. She had built something. She had made a promise to her grandfather and to herself. The work became a rhythm. Each morning she would read a section of the journal. Then she would tackle the task it described. She replaced the rotted porch steps on the cabin, using planks of cedar he had set aside. She reglazed the cabin windows, learning how to work the putty until it was pliable. She scrubbed the interior from top to bottom until the warm scent of the wood filled the small space. She was running low on money. The $400 was nearly gone, spent on food and the few supplies Thomas hadn't stockpiled. She knew she needed more than just salvaged materials to make the marina truly functional. She needed new lumber for the docks, wiring, plumbing fixtures. The journal had a suggestion for that too. If you need materials or a helping hand you can trust, go see Ben at the lumberyard. Tell him you're my granddaughter. I helped him get his start. He's a good man. He understands the value of an honest debt. The next morning, she walked into town, Rusty trotting happily beside her. She found Port Blossom Lumber and Marine at the far end of the harbor. It was a sprawling, open-air yard, stacked high with lumber of every shape and size, and a large, barn-like store filled with marine hardware. A man in his 50s, built like a draft horse with a thick beard and sawdust in his hair, was loading a truck. He looked up as she approached, his expression gruff, impatient. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "I'm looking for Ben," she said. "You found him," he grunted, wiping his hands on his jeans. She took a breath. "My name is Alara Harmon. My grandfather was Thomas Harmon." Ben stopped what he was doing. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. His face changed. The gruffness melted away, replaced by a look of stunned recognition. "Thomas's girl," he said, his voice suddenly quiet. He walked closer, his eyes searching her face. "You have his eyes." He stuck out a large, calloused hand. "Ben Carter, it's an honor to meet you. Your grandfather. He was my mentor. He taught me everything I know about wood. When I wanted to start this yard, the bank laughed at me. Thomas co-signed the loan, never told a soul. He said, 'A man's worth is in his work, not his wallet.' I've tried to live by that." Alara felt that familiar lump in her throat. Her grandfather's legacy wasn't just the marina. It was a web of kindness and respect woven through this entire town. She showed him the list she had made, copied from the journal. A list of specific lumber needed for the main dock, fasteners, and electrical conduit. Ben looked it over, nodding slowly. "This is Tom's list. I recognize the way he planned a project, thinking 3 steps ahead." He looked up at her. "So you're fixing the place up?" "I'm trying," she said. "Good," he said, a smile finally breaking through his beard. "It's what he would have wanted." He led her into his small, cluttered office. "Look, I know Thomas didn't leave you a pile of cash, but he left you something better. I'll set you up with a line of credit. Whatever materials you need, you can work it off. The yard always needs sweeping. Stock needs organizing. 10 hours a week. That fair?" It was more than fair. It was a lifeline. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Ben said, already writing up the account. "I'm just paying a debt I was happy to owe." Her world expanded. She had a job. She had access to materials. The impossible was starting to feel possible. She started working for Ben the next day. The work was simple, physical labor, but she loved it. She loved the smell of the fresh-cut lumber, the heft of the tools. She listened to Ben talk to customers, absorbing the language of the trade. Word began to spread through Port Blossom. Thomas Harmon's granddaughter is back. She's fixing up the old Marina. It started small. One afternoon, an old fisherman named Silas motored into her cove. He had known her grandfather for 50 years. "Heard you were trying to fix these docks," he said, gesturing at the collapsed pier. "Thomas taught me a thing or two about salvage. Let me show you how to use leverage to raise that section, instead of breaking your back." He spent the entire afternoon with her, using ropes and a system of pulleys to lift the heavy, waterlogged section of the dock out of the water. He showed her a knot, the one Thomas had taught him, that wouldn't slip under tension. A few days later, Martha from the diner drove out in her old pickup truck, the bed loaded with boxes. "You can't live on beans and bread," she said, unloading 2 full casseroles, one for dinner, one for the freezer, a bag of fresh vegetables from her garden, and a set of thick, warm curtains for the cabin windows. A place isn't a home until it has curtains. Then came the electrician, a quiet man named Dave. His boat's engine had died in a storm 20 years ago, and Thomas had worked through the night to fix it, refusing any payment. Dave spent a Saturday inspecting the wiring in the boathouse and cabin. He replaced the old, frayed service lines, installed new breakers, and charged her only for the cost of the materials, which he got at a discount from Ben. "Your grandfather gave me a hand when I needed it most," he said simply. "It's the Port Blossom way." The Marina was coming back to life, not just through her labor, but through the collective memory and goodwill of the community. Each person who came to help brought a story with them, a story about Thomas, a story about his quiet generosity, his skill, his integrity. Ilara was not just restoring a property, she was rebuilding her grandfather's reputation. She was uncovering the truth of who he was, and in doing so, she was discovering herself. One evening, after a long day of work, she sat on the newly repaired porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Rusty was asleep at her feet. Ben had dropped off the first load of new lumber, and it sat in a neat stack, smelling of pine and promise. She was tired. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were a roadmap of calluses and small cuts. She had almost no money to her name. But she had a home. She had a dog. She had a job. She had friends. She had a purpose. She looked out at the cove, at the half-repaired docks and the strong, solid boathouse. This was hers. She had earned it, not through a signature on a deed, but through sweat and labor and a willingness to learn. Julian had tried to leave her with nothing. He thought he had succeeded, but he had been wrong. He had left her with everything that mattered. If you've made it this far into Ilara's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Months bled into one another, marked by the changing seasons and the steady progress of the work. Autumn's crisp air gave way to the wet, moody chill of a coastal winter, then softened into the tentative green of spring. The marina transformed under Ilara's relentless care. The main dock was no longer a treacherous ruin. With Ben's lumber and Silas's patient instruction, she had replaced the broken planks, reset the pylons, and installed new cleats. It was a solid, dependable structure now, reaching out into the cove like a welcoming arm. The boathouse was her masterpiece. She had spent the winter inside, protected from the rain and wind, bringing the vast space back to life. She replaced the broken windows, letting the pale winter light flood the interior. She cleaned and oiled the massive winches until they moved smoothly. She organized her grandfather's tools, arranging them on a pegboard, just as he had described in his journal. The place was no longer a dusty tomb. It was a workshop, humming with potential. The cabin was a home, Martha's curtains hung in the windows, and a colorful, hand-braided rug, a gift from another of Thomas's old friends, covered the floor. The wood stove kept the small space warm and cozy, and the smell of cedar was a constant comfort. Alara had changed too. The city softness was gone, replaced by a wiry strength. Her face was weathered by the sun and wind, her hands competent and sure. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own capabilities. She had a life here, a routine of work at the lumber yard, long hours at the marina, and quiet evenings with Rusty and her grandfather's journals. One bright, sunny afternoon in late spring, as she was putting a final coat of linseed oil on the new section of the dock, she heard the sound of an engine. It wasn't one of the familiar local pickup trucks. This was a low, expensive growl, a sleek black sports car, utterly out of place in the rustic setting, pulled to a stop where the track met the marina grounds. The driver's side door opened, and a man got out. It was Julian. He stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. The repaired docks, the gleaming windows of the boathouse, the neat stack of lumber. He was wearing a tailored suit that looked absurdly formal, his expensive leather shoes already dusty. A look of stunned disbelief, quickly followed by a greedy, calculating glimmer, passed over his face. Alara's heart didn't pound. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply stood up, wiping her oily hands on a rag, and waited. She felt a cold, calm certainty settle over her. This was a confrontation she had been unconsciously preparing for since the day she arrived. "Alara," he said, walking toward her, his voice smooth, practiced. "My God, I heard you were out here, but I never imagined this. You've done an incredible amount of work." "Hello, Julian," she said. Her voice was even, steady. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes scanning everything, assessing, valuing. "I was in the area on business," he lied. "I heard a rumor that this old place was being fixed up. There's talk in the real estate world. A deep-water marina, even a small one, on this coast. With the new resort development going in 20 miles south, this property's value has skyrocketed." "Is that so?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Look," he said, shifting his tone to one of earnest sincerity. "I know things ended badly between us. I was under a lot of pressure. I wasn't myself. But I've been thinking about us, about the future we were building." He gestured around the marina. "This was always part of it, wasn't it? An investment. Our investment. We were a team. I handled the finances. You handled the domestic side. This is just an extension of that." Alara stared at him, a kind of detached wonder filling her. He actually believed it. In his world, everything could be reframed to his advantage. Every relationship was a transaction. "There is no us, Julian," she said quietly. "There is no our." His smile tightened. The mask of sincerity slipped. "Don't be naive, Alara. We were together for 3 years. We lived together. Under common law, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. I supported you for years. That gives me a claim, a significant one." "You have no claim here," she said. "I have lawyers who would disagree," he shot back, his voice turning sharp. "This property was an asset acquired during our relationship. I can make a very strong case that I'm entitled to at least half, maybe more, considering the capital I can bring to develop it properly." He was threatening her, using the same legal intimidation that had stripped her of her life in the city. But she wasn't the same person. She wasn't the numb, grief-stricken girl sitting on the floor of an empty apartment. She was standing on her own ground she had earned. "This property was not acquired during our relationship," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the open air. "It was willed to me alone. My name is Alara Harmon. It is on the deed. Your name, Julian, is not on the deed. Your name was never on this Marina." As she spoke, she heard the sound of another truck pulling up. It was Ben's lumber truck. He got out, and with him were Silas and Dave, the electrician. They had been on their way to help her move a heavy workbench. They stood by the truck, silent, watchful. A wall of quiet, steady support. Julian saw them. He saw the way they stood with her. His gaze flickered from their resolute faces back to hers. He saw she was not alone. "This is my home," Alara said, her voice dropping, but losing none of its force. "This is my work. This is my life. You are trespassing. You need to leave." For a long moment, he just stared at her. He saw the woman she had become, strong, grounded, unshakable. He saw a person he could no longer control, no longer manipulate. The asset he had come to claim was not an asset. It was a person's soul, and it was not for sale. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You can have your pile of rotting wood," he spat, his composure finally breaking. He turned on his heel, his expensive shoes slipping on the loose gravel. He got back into his car, slammed the door, and sped away, kicking up a cloud of dust that slowly settled in his wake. Alara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was over, truly over. Ben walked over to her. "You okay?" She nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I am. Good," he said, clapping her on the shoulder. "Now, let's go move that workbench." A week passed. The confrontation with Julian felt like the closing of a book she had been forced to carry for too long. A final chapter written and done. Then another vehicle came down the track. This one was not a sleek sports car. It was a beat-up pickup truck, its engine sputtering. Alara watched from the cabin window as it parked. The man who got out was familiar, but changed. It was Leo, Julian's younger brother. He looked terrible. He was thinner, his clothes were rumpled, and he had the haunted, exhausted look of someone who had seen their world fall apart. He stood uncertainly, looking at the Marina, his hands shoved in his pockets. Alara went outside. Rusty growled low in his throat, but she put a hand on his head to quiet him. "Leo?" she said. He flinched, then turned to her. "Alara, hi." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone wary but not unkind. "Julian's gone," he said, his voice flat. "The resort deal he was banking on. It was a scam. He was leveraged to the hilt. He lost everything. More than everything. He packed a bag and disappeared. He's probably in another country by now." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a miserable shame. I'm sorry, Alara. For everything. I knew what he was doing to you was wrong. I stood by and I let it happen. I was always in his shadow, you know. I was weak. I was jealous of his confidence, of the way things just seemed to work for him. I went along with it. And now I have nothing either. He gestured vaguely with his head towards the end of the main pier. I saw, when I drove in, the end of that dock needs a new footing. The old one is crumbling. He took a shaky breath. I know how to pour concrete. I used to do it summers. During college, I could do that for you, if you'll let me. For nothing. I need to do something right. Alara studied him for a long time. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. He wasn't his brother. He wasn't driven by greed, but by a weakness he was finally ready to confront. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. A thing isn't ruined until you give up on its story. She nodded slowly. The bags of concrete mix are in the boathouse, she said. The shovel is leaning against the wall. Leo looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and profound relief. Thank you, he whispered. He didn't say another word. He went to the boathouse, found the materials, and got to work. He spent the rest of the day in the hot sun, mixing concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow, building a form and pouring a new, solid footing for the pier. He did a good job, a clean, professional job. When he was finished, he cleaned the tools and put them away, more carefully than he had found them. He came to her, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "It's done," he said. "Thank you, Leo," she said. He just nodded, then got into his old truck and drove away. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a friendship. It was something quieter, an acknowledgement, a small act of atonement, a single solid footing on which perhaps he could start to build something new for himself. Alara walked to the end of the pier and looked at the fresh, wet concrete. It was a small repair in the grand scheme of the marina, but it felt important. It felt like balance. The summer was warm and golden. Alara's days were long and full, split between her hours at the lumberyard and the endless, satisfying work at the marina. The place had become a small hub of quiet activity. A few local fishermen now paid a modest fee to moor their boats at her restored docks, providing her with a small but steady income. Her final major project was the restoration of the boathouse interior, not just cleaning it, but making it a true, working boat shop again, as her grandfather had intended. This meant tackling the heart of the workshop, his personal workbench. It was a magnificent piece of furniture, 10 feet long, made from a single massive slab of maple, its surface scarred and stained with the history of 1,000 projects. She had cleaned it, but she wanted to restore it properly. The last few pages of the final journal were dedicated to it. "The bench is the soul of the shop," Thomas wrote. "I built it from a tree that fell in a storm on this very property. It knows this place. Treat it with respect." He detailed the process for sanding it down, for filling the deeper gouges with custom-mixed wood putty, for applying a new finish of tung oil and beeswax. She followed his instructions meticulously. The work was slow, meditative. Sanding by hand, she felt the history of the wood under her fingers. The last entry in the journal was cryptic. "When you have restored my bench, you will be ready for the last secret, the heart of the heart. Look in the place where I kept my most delicate tools." She had already cleaned out all the drawers. They were filled with beautiful, old chisels, calipers, and measuring devices. She had polished each one. She ran her hand inside the top right drawer, the one for the smallest, most delicate tools. The wood was smooth. She frowned, puzzled. She pulled the drawer all the way out and set it on the bench. Then she reached into the empty space inside the bench. Her fingers brushed against a small, wooden toggle she hadn't noticed before. She pushed it. With a soft click, a section of the bottom of the drawer cavity dropped down on a tiny, hidden hinge, revealing a shallow, secret compartment. A false bottom. Her breath caught. Inside the compartment lay a single, sealed envelope. It was made of thick, creamy paper, now yellowed with age. Written on the front in her grandfather's familiar, strong script was one word: Alara. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. This felt different from the journals. The journals were a guide. This was a destination. This was the final revelation, the heart of the heart. She took the letter from the boathouse, walking slowly back to the cabin. Rusty met her at the door, sensing the gravity of the moment. She sat down at the small table her grandfather had built, the late afternoon sun slanting through the clean window pane. The dog rested his head on her lap. For a long time, she just held the envelope, feeling the weight of it, the years of silence it contained. Then she took a deep breath and carefully broke the wax seal. She unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter began without preamble. "My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, you have rebuilt my life's work, and you have become the woman I always knew you would be. There are things you deserve to know, truths your mother could not bring herself to tell you. She did not leave me because I worked with my hands. That was the story she told herself and the world, to make her choice easier. The truth is, she fell in love with a man who promised her a world without struggle, a world of comfort and ease. I could not blame her for wanting that. But that man, the man you knew as a distant stepfather, was jealous and controlling. He saw me, and the life she came from, as a threat to his control over her. He insisted she cut all ties. The estrangement was his demand, and her choice to obey it. She was not a bad person, Elara. She was just a frightened one. But there is another, deeper truth you must know. It is about your father. Your mother told you he was a man she met after she left Port Blossom. That is not true. Your father was a young sailor named Daniel. His boat was based here for a summer. He was full of life and laughter, and he loved the sea almost as much as I do. He and your mother fell deeply in love. I loved him like a son. He was going to quit the sea, stay here, and work with me in the shop. Before he could, his ship was caught in a hurricane off the Carolinas. There were no survivors. Your mother was already pregnant with you. She was devastated, broken. When she met the other man, the wealthy one, a few months later, she saw a chance to escape the ghost of that grief, to escape this place and all its memories. She let him believe you were his, and he raised you as such, though he never truly loved you as his own. She erased Daniel from her story. I do not tell you this to cause you more pain. I tell you this so you can understand. Your life was not born from rejection, but from a great and tragic love. You are the legacy of a good man who loved your mother and the sea. You have his spirit. That is why you understand this place. It is in your blood. Elara read the letter again, and then a third time, the words blurring through her tears. The story of her life, a story she had always felt was defined by absence and abandonment, was suddenly reframed. Her mother's coldness wasn't about her. It was about her mother's own fear and grief. Her stepfather's distance wasn't a rejection of her, but a reflection of a lie he had been told. And her father, he wasn't an anonymous figure. He was a man her grandfather had loved, a man who had loved her mother, a man who had died tragically. The grief she felt was immense, but it was clean. It was a grief for a love story cut short, for a father she never knew. It replaced the old, murky feeling of being unwanted. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the one that made her own story make sense. She looked out the window, at the cove sparkling in the sun. She was not a stray, washed up on this shore by chance. She was an anchor, finding her rightful holding ground. Tucked into the fold of the letter was a small, faded photograph. A young, smiling man with kind eyes and sun-bleached hair, his arm around a young, radiant version of her mother. Behind them was the unmistakable shoreline of the cove, her father, Daniel. The letter contained one last thing, an address for her mother in Florida. "She is alone now," her grandfather had written. "He left her years ago. I do not know if she would want to see you, but you have a right to choose." Elara sat at the table for hours, watching the light fade. She thought about the anger she had carried for so long. It felt distant now, replaced by a complex, aching pity. The next morning, she went to the post office. She bought a single postcard, one with a picture of the Port Blossom harbor. She wrote a short, simple message on the back. "I'm at Grandfather's Marina. It's beautiful. I found his letter. I know about Daniel. I hope you have found peace." She signed it, Elara. She addressed it to her mother and dropped it in the mailbox. It was not a request for a relationship. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that she was in control of her own story now. Whether her mother ever replied didn't matter. The act of sending it, of reaching out not from a place of need, but from a place of strength and understanding, was its own form of closure. She walked back to the marina, feeling lighter than she had in her entire life. The last ghost had been laid to rest. The work of restoration was complete, both outside and in. A year passed, then another. Then, the Marina settled into a new life, a rhythm of seasons and tides. Harmon's Landing was no longer a secret. It was a landmark. It wasn't a bustling commercial enterprise. That was never Alara's goal. It was a small, thriving haven for people who, like her grandfather, loved the water and respected the craft of a well-made boat. The half-dozen slips she maintained were always full, rented by local fishermen and a few sailing enthusiasts who cherished the quiet, protected cove. The income was modest, but combined with her part-time work for Ben, it was enough. She lived simply. She was content. The boathouse was the true heart of the place. It was a working shop again. Alara had discovered a deep, innate talent for the work, the one her grandfather had predicted. She had his hands. She started by doing small repairs for her tenants, then for others in Port Blossom. Her work was good, her prices fair. She had her grandfather's touch, people said. She could heal boats. The cabin was her sanctuary. The wood had warmed with time, the curtains were faded by the sun, and every object held a story. It was a real home, filled with the quiet companionship of Rusty, now a venerable old dog, who spent his days sleeping in patches of sun. One crisp autumn morning, Alara walked through the marina, a mug of hot coffee in her hands. She paused on the main dock, looking back at what she had built. The boathouse stood tall and true, its new roof silvered by the weather. The cabin was nestled in the pines, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The docks were clean and orderly, the boats bobbing gently in the clear water. It was complete, not perfect, not sterile. It was alive. It had scars and stories and a deep, abiding strength. It had a soul. She sat on the porch steps of the cabin, the same steps she had rebuilt with her own hands. Rusty came and laid his heavy head on her knee. She looked out over the cove, the water a brilliant blue under the morning sun. The air was clean and tasted of salt and pine. It was a quiet triumph. There were no crowds, no applause, just a profound, earned peace. The feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, of having built a life that was truly her own, piece by painstaking piece. The crushing loss, the betrayal, the loneliness, they were all part of the story now, the foundation upon which this new life was built. They were the reason the structure was so strong. Later that day, a movement near the boathouse caught her eye. A local teenager named Maya was standing there, watching her. Maya was a quiet, solitary girl, a bit of an outcast in town, who had started hanging around the marina a few months ago. She never said much, but Alara would often see her watching from a distance, her eyes full of a hungry curiosity. Alara had seen a younger version of herself in the girl's guarded posture. Inside the boathouse was a small dinghy, a project her grandfather had started but never finished. The hull was complete, but the interior needed to be fitted out, sanded and sealed. Alara had been meaning to get to it. She waved Maya over. The girl approached hesitantly. "See that little boat?" Alara said, gesturing with her head toward the boathouse. "She needs finishing. A boat's no good until it can meet the water." Maya just nodded, her eyes fixed on the dinghy. "Want to learn how to finish her?" Alara asked, her voice gentle. The girl's head snapped up. Her eyes, which were usually downcast, were wide with a mixture of shock and hope. She looked at Alara, then back at the boat, then back at Alara. Slowly she nodded, a real decisive nod. A slow smile spread across Alara's face. She stood up and walked toward the boathouse, Maya following a step behind her. The legacy wasn't just the property, the wooden nails and stone. It was the knowledge, the skill, the act of passing it on. The door to the workshop was open. The marina held,